Hello, my name is Oliver Heath. I'm an architectural and interior designer, and today I'm speaking to you from my office in Brighton in the UK, where you're probably likely to hear seagulls in the background. Now, today I'd like to be talking to you about the emerging design ethos of biophilic design. Over the last 20 years, I've been fascinated by sustainability, and not just how we implement it into buildings, but why we might do that. Now, that conversation has slowly spread into the more human-centered approach of health and well-being. And it's that subject that I'm going to be talking to you about today, and in particular, the science and style of biophilic design, or essentially how we enhance the human connection to nature in the buildings that are so important to our lives, and the role that timber has to play in it. Now, my architectural and interior design company are both researchers, where we compile and collate research, we write white papers, and we create design strategies for how we might implement biophilic design into all sorts of spaces, be that education, workplace, hospitality, or healthcare. We also are designers, so we three-dimensionalize that research to create happy, healthy, and thriving environments for a range of organizations like Bloomberg, Booking.com, Deutsche Bank, and organizations all over the world. Now, over the last 20 years, the conversation around sustainable buildings has been largely carbon-centered. So it looks at the impact that buildings have on the environment. But what we're now seeing is a deeper understanding of the impact that humans have on buildings and businesses. And in fact, this chart by the World Green Building Council demonstrates exactly that. Because what it suggests is that 1% of typical business operating costs are in energy, things like gas and electricity. So we're now talking about in-use carbon. But actually 90% of typical business operating costs are actually in staff salaries and benefits. So when we take this human-centered approach, clearly there are very tangible benefits to be had for building occupants, but also building and business owners who get to experience lower running costs and improved building outcomes. Now, the wellness real estate industry back in 2017 was worth $134 billion. And at that stage, according to the Global Wellness Institute, it was growing at 6.4% each year. Now, in all likelihood, since the global pandemic, this recognition of the impacts that buildings have on people and their ability to perform specific functions will have risen up the agenda significantly. So I believe these numbers are now set to be revised. So why are we now talking about well-being and design, and in particular biophilic design? Well, for me, it's a number of reasons. Firstly, stress is endemic in our modern day lives, and it negatively impacts our life in buildings. In fact, a health and safety executive study in the UK from 2017 to 2018 stated that stress accounts for 44% of all work-related ill health cases and 57% of all working days lost due to ill health. Urbanization is at a rate of 90% in the United Kingdom, and globally, it's set to reach 68% by 2050. Now, inevitably, when we live in cities, we have a reduced connection to nature, and that can be negative on the impact of the way that we operate in spaces. Of course, we spend 90% of our time indoors, as the research shows, and probably more than that since the global pandemic hit. As well as that, we have a massive proliferation of technology all around us in our lives. And in fact, 93% of UK adults now have smartphone technology. And this can be very distracting. We don't give ourselves the opportunity to rest, relax, and recuperate as we once did. And that can be very damaging because we are a distracted generation. We are overwhelmed. We're constantly getting distracting sensory stimuli, which causes us to lose concentration. And in fact, the research shows that 70% of office workers feel distracted on a daily basis. 34% of employees report lower job satisfaction when working in a distracting environment. And it can take as long as 23 minutes to physically refocus when we're distracted. Now, this increases stress and adrenaline and reduces overall well-being and, importantly, productivity in buildings. Yet, when we think of a space where we feel most happy, most calm, and most relaxed, and we picture that space in our minds, where are we thinking? I mean, are we thinking of our offices? Are we thinking of our streets and our cities with all that noise and distraction and those angular shapes? Well, probably not. When we're asked to think of a space where we feel most happy, calm and relaxed, the likelihood is that we're thinking of a space in nature. Maybe a space with water, trees and grass, maybe the beach, the mountains or the forest. So why is it that we all share this utopian vision of spaces that make us feel so good when actually we tend to live in cities? Well, I believe that the answer lies in biophilia. And biophilia quite literally means a love of nature, and it explains humans' innate attraction to nature and natural processes. It's an idea that was popularized in the 1980s by the American biologist Edward O. Wilson when he recognized society's departure from rural dwellings and into city centers and the inability for the city to actually help us to relax and rest and recuperate, and the very many negative consequences of all that built up stress. Now, biophilic design is an evolutionary design approach that recognizes that for 99.5% of human evolution, we evolved in very close connection to healthy forms of nature. And that informed how our senses developed. And our senses were there in a way to help us to survive and thrive in those natural environments. Through our sense of sight, sense of smell, touch, sound, taste, vestibular sense, that's our sense of balance, and also proprioception, which is our body's movement in space. And we used all of those senses to recognize landscapes that could help us survive and thrive and to actually kind of develop. As a result of that, an idea has been developed called the Savannah hypothesis that suggests that actually when we look out over healthy forms of nature, it has the ability to make us feel good. It is in a way a genetic inheritance that allows us to recognize landscapes that are potentially threatening and equally landscapes that can help us to survive, thrive and flourish. Because when we see lush open landscapes from a point of safety or what we call prospect, when we have elements of greenery, we have the ability to pick fruit and nuts and berries. We have rocks for building, water for hydration. We have open landscapes that allow us to see potential targets, but also potential threats. Then actually, it has the ability to reduce heart rates and blood pressure levels. It helps us to relax, to reduce stress, and importantly, to recuperate. The difficult thing is that how do we translate these ideas of the Savannah theory into our dense, noisy, urban, and geometric cities? Well, that is exactly where biophilic design steps in. Now, there are three core constructs to biophilic design. The first is what we call a direct connection to nature. This is how we bring in those sensory forms of nature, the use of water, trees, plants, natural light, fresh air, and the gentle movement that we see in nature. The second is what we call an indirect connection to nature. This is how we mimic or evoke a feeling of nature in the built environment, using natural materials, colors, textures, patterns, and technologies. And this area, I think, is in particular very important to the world of timber. And the third is what we call a human spatial response. This is how we create spaces that are energizing, stimulating, and exciting. How do we create buildings that we actually want to go to, but also create buildings that are relaxing, restorative, and recuperative? Now, what is interesting about biophilic design is that it's an evidence-based approach to design, which means there are 30 years of studies by environmental psychologists that demonstrate the many benefits that nature brings to buildings and its ability to reduce negative costs, things like absenteeism and presenteeism, but also to enhance outcomes, things like productivity, engagement, and creativity. And in fact, what the studies show is that when elements of biophilic design, those direct connections are brought in, it can boost energy levels by 76%, self-reported happiness goes up by 78%, self-reported health by 65%, and productivity goes up by between 6 and 15%, and reduces absenteeism by 15%. So what it starts to do is to create a business case for a design ethos. Now, when we talk about the benefits of timber, actually, we're talking about those indirect connections. And what the research shows is that even simulated natural environments can facilitate stress relief. There are three ways that we can bring indirect connections into the built environment. The first is through what we call biomorphic shapes and forms, those that mimic those we find in nature. The second is in the use of natural materials and textures through sensory benefits like touch, vision, and sound. And the third is in the use of natural patterns and what we call complexity and order in visual, which is visually stimulating. Now, the use of timber has many benefits in indirect connections to nature. It creates an information richness, which creates diverse and variable environments. It's naturalistic in shapes and forms. It creates what we call biophilic fractal patterning, which are those sense of patterns and textures that we're so familiar with in the natural world. It is also has a sense of change throughout time, much like nature has, as it ages and gains that sense of patina. So it's constantly moving. It also allows us to create a sense of cultural and ecological attachment to place. And the use of natural materials is both dynamic and unique. Now, when we dig a little bit deeper, there are many benefits to the use of timber, both physiologically and psychologically, whether that's on the wall, the floors, ceilings, or furniture. It has the ability to reduce blood pressure and heart rates, improve pain perception and lower pain recovery time, improved attention, focus, and emotional states, increased environmental satisfaction. And in fact, one statistic shows that the use of real timber beds can reduce heart rates by an amazing 3,500 beats per day. And when we dig deeper into other building typologies, timber in the workplace, for instance, research compares a workplace with 20% wooden surfaces versus those with 60% wooden surfaces. And it found that stress levels were lower by 16%. The ability to concentrate increased by 18%. Physical workplace satisfaction increases by 34%. Satisfaction with working life increases by 25%. And optimism about the future increased by 17%. So really significant numbers about improved occupant experience. And in the world of education, actually research studies show that students in classrooms with real timber walls had a heart rate of an average of 8,600 beats per day less than normal classrooms, allowing the students to feel more relaxed, more comfortable, and to focus on the educational levels at hand. Timber is also durable. And in fact, it's durable in many different ways. From a planetary perspective, conscious consumers understand that timber use has the potential to lock in carbon. It meets their environmental provenance and well-being concerns. The use of timber can signify environmental awareness in design aesthetics. Physically, it's versatile, durable, and resistant to aggressive compounds and extreme environmental conditions. It can survive in use for hundreds of years, and the minimal maintenance can reduce physical stress and disruption for occupants. And from an emotional perspective, well, architectural styles come and go, and that can be polarizing. But natural materials have a timelessness which can appeal for longer periods of time. Interestingly, a research study in North America found that the lifespans of buildings aren't usually related to structural failure. Most are demolished due to the changing land values, tastes, needs, as well as a lack of maintenance of non-structural components. Now, when we talk about how we integrate biophilic design in, we tend to encourage our clients to think about the nature diet triangle. What it suggests is that we need a connection to nature across different time periods and across different spaces. So it may be that some of those more carbon intensive, more deeper immersive experiences happen on an international basis, perhaps when we travel abroad for a summer holiday. And that's maybe once or twice a year. On a national level, maybe on a monthly basis, we might connect with an element of nature. On a regional basis, perhaps more frequently on a weekly basis, and on a daily basis. How do we connect with that sense of nature? And essentially, what is it? What constitutes a healthy dose of nature? And what role, I would ask, does timber play in enhancing that connection to nature? And as much as the research shows, clearly there is benefit to the use of timber in the built environment. Biophilic design is an emerging ethos that has multiple benefits. There are benefits for us in the timber and design industries because we get to deliver an enhanced level of service and improved buildings. There are benefits for building occupants who get to experience low levels of stress and a better live-work balance. There are benefits, of course, for building and business owners when they recognize that actually there are reduced costs but improved building outcomes. And of course, there is a wider environmental benefit, that when we recognize that our health and well-being is intrinsically linked to the wider environment around us, it leads us to a greater empathy and desire for the conservation of our wider environment. The use of timber in the built environment is an essential component in how we create happier and healthier buildings, because it's better for people, it's better for the planet, and it's better for productivity. Thank you very much.